Story begin in Texas City, more precisely on a highway in the city of El Paso, which is the border between the United States and Mexico. There is a man named John Creasy, where he is on his way to Mexico to meet one of his old friends to find a job. After a long journey, Creasy arrived in Mexico. He was greeted by his best friend named Paul Rayburn, where after chatting about stories in the past, Creasy immediately expressed his intentions and needs, which are currently looking for job vacancies. Unfortunately, Rayburn didn't have any information about a job that suited Creasy's background, so he can only promise that if there is information later, he will immediately inform Creasy about it. Additional information that Creasy is a former member of the United States Best Special Forces. He has been assigned to conduct hostage rescue counterterrorism missions. In fact, he was also assigned to a dangerous zone, such as tracking and eliminating an important target, that is a supreme leader of a crime syndicate group. It can be concluded that Creasy is not just a normal person. He has above-average abilities and advantages, although in the end he decided to resign from his job. Meanwhile, located inside a fancy restaurant, a wealthy automotive entrepreneur named Samuel Ramos was seen, where his existence is quite influential in the business economic growth sector in Mexico. At this moment, Ramos was seen talking with his personal lawyer named Jordan Calvis. They both discussed the rampant kidnapping in Mexico, which is increasingly worrying. As we know, Mexico is one of the countries with the highest crime rate on Earth, where kidnappings, drug deals, and even murders are very common. In this conversation, it can be concluded that Ramos is looking for a bodyguard for the safety of his little daughter, so he asked Jordan the lawyer to help him find someone to look after and guarding his daughter. Hearing that, the lawyer remembered to Paul Rayburn. At that moment, he immediately contacted Rayburn and asked for his help in finding a bodyguard who had a lot of experience, which of course was to guard the child of one of his clients, a wealthy businessman, Ramos. Coincidentally, Rayburn was still with Creasy. At that moment, Rayburn gave Creasy the good news about the job vacancy. Long story short, after Creasy was meet with Ramos, who had just seen Creasy's file, seemed to be very impressed after learning that Creasy had a very long experience in the military, although he did consider Creasy's bad habit of being an alcoholic. And then Ramos was convinced that Creasy was the right person to look after his daughter. He brought him to his house and introduced Creasy to his wife, Lisa. Lisa invites a conversation while reading Creasy's file, which contains a lot of experience. At that moment, Lisa was immediately attracted to this man. Even from all the candidates who had been interviewed before, Lisa felt that Creasy was the only right person to be her daughter's bodyguard. Not long after, Ramos and Lisa's only daughter appeared. She was a beautiful 8-year-old girl named Lupita. She is a jolly girl who is well-mannered, intelligent, and very spoiled. It didn't take long for Lupita to get to know Creasy. Like a little girl who has just made a new friend, Lupita seems to feel comfortable and like Creasy, whom she has just met. The little girl's happiness was shared with her mother, who said that she saw the sincerity in Creasy, but also felt the deep sadness behind the man's sincerity. The next day, Creasy started his first day. He drove Lupita to school, showing his loyalty and trying to stay focused in every situation and condition. On the way, a curious Lupita keeps asking questions about Creasy's side of life, but the seemingly endless questions from the little girl led Creasy to finally say that he was only assigned to look after Lupita, not to be her chat buddy. Hearing this, Lupita became upset. With an innocent face, Lupita sulked and moved to the back seat. Later that night, Creasy looked restless and sad when he remembered his past. It turned out that Creasy had been depressed all this time, feeling always overshadowed by the events he had committed, killing hundreds of life with great cruelty. Until finally God cursed his actions and gave him punishment in the form of inner torment. The overwhelming guilt made his heart even more fragile. Until that night, he intended to end his life by putting a gun to his head. And just as he wanted to pull the trigger, he failed to do so. Feeling strange about his gun not working every time he tried to kill himself, Creasy felt the need to contact his best friend, Rayburn, to ask about the oddity. Hearing this, Rayburn said that bullets never lie. When a bullet is successfully fired and the person dies, it means that the person is destined to die. But on the other hand, when the trigger is released and always fails to remove the bullet casing, it is undeniable that the person is not destined to die. In the midst of the pouring rain, Creasy accidentally saw Lupita looking at him through the window. And that's when Creasy took a moment to reflect, until he got an answer, realizing that behind his failure, it couldn't be separated from God's plan to still give him the opportunity to live. Indirectly, he seemed to be given the trust to guard and protect someone's life through a little girl named Lupita. The next day, Creasy returned to his usual job of taking Lupita to school. But on the way, Creasy accidentally glanced at the rearview mirror, and that's when he saw a very suspicious car. The car seemed to be following them from behind. Creasy was so suspicious that he immediately wrote down the car's license plate. He didn't know what the purpose was, but he felt he needed to find out who was behind the stalker. In the afternoon, after Lupita returned home from school, Creasy immediately took his boss's daughter to swimming lessons in preparation for a swimming competition that would soon take place. But after the trials, the disappointment on Lupita's face was clear, as she was unable to get the victory she had hoped for. No matter how hard she tried, she still failed and found it difficult to reach the top 3 positions. As if recognizing Lupita's anxiety, Creasy, with the instinct of a father, tried to calm and encourage this little girl. As a former Marine with experience in swimming, Creasy knew full well what the cause of Lupita's defeat lay. Creasy had seen Lupita's split-second late jumping into the pool, and it was confirmed by Creasy that the problem was only because Lupita was surprised to hear the sound of the signal shot to start. That is, until Creasy's sincerity finally kicked in. He trained Lupita every day by focusing on speed training and reflexes, so that she would no longer be startled when she heard gunshots. After a few days of training, there was a significant improvement. Lupita was able to break records with above-average speed. This made Creasy proud and happy. Long story short, the long-awaited competition finally arrived. Lupita, who couldn't be accompanied by her parents who were busy working, began to get used to the presence of Creasy, who always accompanied her. Lupita also managed to reach finish before the others. The little girl embraced Creasy as a form of happiness. And since then, Creasy and Lupita's closeness has grown closer like best friends. Without Creasy realizing it, Lupita's presence has erased his sadness. His days were always filled with smiles and laughter. He was even able to leave his bad alcoholic habits behind. This proves that Creasy has regained his zest for life because of a little girl named Lupita. Until one day, when Creasy took Lupita to piano lessons at her father's insistence, Creasy saw a forced look on Lupita's face. It seemed like the little girl had no interest in music. But either way, Lupita seemed to have no power to argue. Her only interest in swimming was so strong that she couldn't help but reluctantly comply with her father's wishes. While waiting for Lupita outside the building, Creasy suddenly began to sense something odd around him. He saw a police car on patrol blocking the entrance to the piano lessons building. Curiosity made his eyes pay closer attention to the surrounding environment, until his view was focused on a silver car that was moving. The car turned out to be a car with the same license plate as the car that had followed them a few days ago. The shootout ended just as Creasy fell with a bullet now lodged in his chest, and unfortunately Lupita, who was supposed to run away, returned to the shooting location and screamed hysterically over Creasy's body, which was now lying unconscious. Then Lupita was successfully kidnapped. Still unconscious, Creasy lay on a hospital bed. Creasy didn't realize that he was now a suspect in police custody. He was accused of carrying out a shooting attack on 2 police officers, as well as the kidnapping of a young girl, Lupita. In the middle of the press conference, a reporter from a local newspaper named Mariana Garcia and the director of National Security of Mexico named Miguel Manzano didn't believe the facts alleged by the Mexican police against Creasy. They both seemed to have known that Lupita's kidnapping involved Mexican police hiding behind their uniforms and tittle. Meanwhile, at the Ramos residence, he and Lisa are in a panic. Of course, they were worried about the safety of their daughter Lupita. Until not long ago, a phone call was heard in which a cross-therapy caller who was the leader of the kidnapping network group, or we call it The Voice, asked Ramos to prepare a ransom of $10 million as a condition for exchanging Lupita's freedom. The Voice also threatened Ramos not to involve the police, because if that happened, then The Voice wouldn't hesitate to finish Lupita off. The police agency, which happened to be monitoring the conversation, of course had no other option but to follow The Voice's wishes. They now left it entirely in Ramos' decision to deliver the ransom money to the kidnapper's designated location. Long story short, night fell. In accordance with the agreement, Ramos was instructed by The Voice to bring the ransom money himself. He quickly dragged 2 bags of cash and put them in the trunk of a car parked in an empty lot. Just as Ramos left the scene to return to his car, the kidnappers were suddenly attacked by a group of unidentified men, until they looted the ransom money from The Voice. The shootout caused one of The Voice's group to die. Unfortunately, that figure turned out to be The Voice's sibling, so when he heard information about his brother's death, as well as the loss of the ransom money, The Voice assumed that Ramos had deceived him by sending his messenger to take back the ransom money. Hearing this, Lisa quickly snatched the phone from her husband's grasp. Frantic and hysterical, Lisa begged The Voice to give her a second chance by promising to hand over the ransom money a second time. But for all Lisa's attempts to persuade The Voice no longer wanted direct negotiations. He insisted that his brother's life must be paid for with Lupita's life. The next day at the hospital, Rayburn, who was intending to visit Creasy, his best friend, saw a corrupt police officer with suspicious movements. And when the policeman left the scene, that's when Rayburn resumed his search to find the room where Creasy was currently being treated. But in the middle of his search, Rayburn happened to see Miguel taking Creasy out of the room. At first, Rayburn objected and asked where he wanted to take Creasy. In a low, half-whispered voice, Miguel introduced himself, then answered Rayburn's question by saying that Creasy had to be removed from the hospital as soon as possible. Because after all, after Creasy killed 2 policemen a few days ago, it is certain that the hospital is no longer a safe place for Creasy. To make a long story short, Creasy is taken to a convent, which is the only place that is considered safe enough. When Creasy wakes up from his coma, Miguel asks Creasy to cooperate in solving the kidnapping cases that have been happening lately. Hopefully, there will still be enough time to save Lupita and the other victims from the kidnappers' clutches. A few days later, after his condition began to improve, accompanied by Rayburn, Creasy visited the site of the shootout and the location of Lupita's abduction. There, Creasy saw the chalk lines that marked the spot where the victims had fallen. Creasy is momentarily stunned, trying to remember what happened a few days ago. He felt disappointed with himself because he was no longer able to get up. He didn't even realize that the kidnappers had taken Lupita by force. Moving away from the kidnapping scene, Creasy, who was still accompanied by Rayburn, went to Ramos' house to pack the rest of his belongings. After packing up his belongings and about to leave, Creasy was suddenly taken aback when he remembered his time with Lupita, the jolly girl. From his face expression, there was the sadness of a father who had lost his own daughter, while he was focused on reading Lupita's diary, which contained confessions about himself. At the same time, Lisa walked in, startling Creasy. Lisa looks uncomfortable seeing Creasy there. So Creasy apologized for having the audacity to enter Lupita's room without permission by saying that his purpose in entering there was only to look for his Bible, which he felt might be in Lupita's room. No longer questioning Creasy's presence in there, Lisa suddenly burst into tears when she remembered her daughter. For some reason, Creasy felt like his heart was being sliced open after hearing Lisa's story. The obvious anger on her face made him want to do something that would surely bring suffering to the kidnappers, vowing to give them pain before they died. At that very moment, there was no time to waste. Creasy immediately went to the gun shop to buy some equipment, such as a pistol and rifle, some handheld grenades along with a bazooka unit. Once the equipment was sufficient, Creasy then asked Mariana for help. To find information on someone's address based on tracking license plates, that was the license plate number of a car that had followed him some time ago. After getting the location of the stalker's address with Mariana's help, Creasy immediately visited the location, which was located in an apartment in the small town of Los Arcos. This stalker turned out to be a policeman with George Gonzalez. George looked very surprised when he saw Creasy pointing a gun. Not long after, the car stopped at a very quiet cliff location. Creasy put the policeman's hands on the steering wheel and interrogated him in a rather extreme way. Later that night, armed with George's information, Creasy went back into action by immediately visiting the discotheque. There he tried to ask 2 guards by giving them some money. But when he didn't get the answers he expected, Creasy lost his tolerance and went on a rampage. After getting some information, Creasy then brought out a little girl who was one of the kidnapped victims. Then he set fire to the building and contacted Mariana to come to the location to ask for help again. Upon Mariana's arrival, Creasy then asked for her help to find out who made the deposits into the account, while handing over the ATM card along with the PIN code. Long story short, morning then come. Wearing a suit and sunglasses, Creasy walked down the street in a small town, carrying a bag of weaponry, while occasionally glancing in all directions to ensure the safety of his surroundings. Before long, his steps stopped right at the end of the street, where his gaze fell on a painting shop. He noticed that someone was standing on the 2nd floor of the shop. Creasy could freely see the activities of the police station across the street, without even a single object blocking his view. At that moment, Creasy approached the painting shop. He asked the owner, an elderly couple, for permission to enter the shop. After setting up a bazooka that was set right towards the police station, Victor Fuentes' motorcade appeared, which was only about 200 meters away. Without wasting any more time, Creasy immediately opened fire with bazooka ammunition, destroying one of Fuentes' men's cars. Right under a bridge, Creasy tied Fuentes' hands with duct tape over his eyes. He then interrogated him with a question about Lupita's ransom money, which had suddenly been seized by someone. Upon hearing the question, Fuentes adamantly refused to be reasoned with. He didn't show a cooperative attitude at all. In fact, he proudly boasted of his position as president of La Hermandad. Receiving a threat from Creasy that he felt wasn't just a bluff, Fuentes, whose face began to show a look of fear, finally reluctantly told the chronology behind Lupita's kidnapping. In the story, a new fact is revealed, where Ramos' personal lawyer, Jordan Calvis, has been conspiring with Fuentes to get a $10 million ransom from Lupita's kidnapping. Calvis hired a group of kidnappers led by The Voice. Unfortunately, Fuentes didn't want to share the proceeds and ended up cheating Calvis. He sent his men to attack the kidnappers, even snatching the ransom money from The Voice's men during the transaction. However, as we know, the attack from Fuentes' men resulted in the death of The Voice's younger brother. So from then on, the chaos escalates, leaving the kidnapper with an unforgivable grudge that threatens Lupita's life. Creasy, who realized that Calvis' path was the only person who knew the identity of the leader of the kidnappers or The Voice. At that moment, he left to visit Calvis' residence while blowing up the car along with Fuentes, who was still attached to the hood of his car. Long story short, Creasy arrived at the residence of Calvis, who is Ramos' lawyer. But when he went inside, he was immediately shocked when he saw Calvis' body floating in his swimming pool, which was now filled with blood. Leaving the pool, Creasy entered Calvis' office to search for clues. And that's when Creasy found a bank statement containing transactions on behalf of Ramos. So Creasy realized and was very sure that Ramos was certainly involved in the kidnapping of his own daughter. Creasy's curiosity led him to Ramos' house. There, he urges Ramos to tell him what really happened. At the same time, Lisa appears, who initially doesn't believe the facts about her husband. In the midst of feeling guilty and regretting his actions, Ramos finally tells what really happened. Where this chaos began when Ramos started to realize his company was going bankrupt, debts everywhere, even assets began to disappear one by one. So, it was revealed that the meeting between Ramos and Calvis at that time was none other than discussing the debt problems experienced by Ramos. And what's worse is that Calvis as a lawyer actually suggested to Ramos that he engineer the kidnapping of Lupita, his own daughter, with the aim that Lupita's insurance can be dispersed, which is estimated to reach up to $10 million. But unfortunately, the plan didn't go as expected. All the engineering orchestrated by Calvis fails only because of a group of men who suddenly attack, even resulting in the loss of life of the kidnapper's siblings. As a result of all this, the kidnapper was furious, and Lupita was now truly a victim. Hearing the explanation from her husband certainly made Lisa look very angry. She couldn't believe that her husband had done something so stupid without caring about the risks that would occur. Annoyance mixed with anger made Lisa immediately utter swear words, until a very big intention arose in her to finish her husband with her own hands as a release to heal her heartache. However, Creasy prevented that from happening. He just didn't want Lisa to end up as a murder suspect, so he gave Ramos a gun and a bullet to determine whether Ramos deserved to die, or perhaps still be given a chance to live by surrendering his fate to a bullet, as Creasy had done some time ago. The next day, Creasy, who had already pocketed one of the names of the kidnap gang. Creasy immediately visited the house of the kidnapper, Aurelio Sanchez, where the action this time, without Creasy realizing it, was being monitored by Miguel Manzano. With a gunshot wound to his chest, Creasy tried with all his rest power to survive, forcing himself to chase after Sanchez at that very moment. No longer able to put up a fight, Sanchez was forcibly dragged back to his house. Even his pregnant wife was ordered by Creasy to sit without additional movement. Sanchez's wife doesn't want anything to happen to her husband. In the end, she tells him that the leader of the kidnapping network is a man named Daniel, who is none other than his own brother and the mastermind of all kidnappings in Mexico. There was some relief when Creasy heard that information, so he invited Daniel to make an exchange, where Creasy asked Daniel to hand over Lupita in exchange for his own life. After agreeing and determining the location of the exchange, Creasy immediately rushed to the location with Sanchez, who was still used as a hostage, to anticipate if Daniel wasn't trustworthy with his words. Long story short, they finally arrived at the location, where Creasy asked Lisa to help him point a gun at Sanchez, while he himself would make an exchange with Daniel. Not long after, Lupita was released from the car and ran over to Creasy to hug John Creasy very tightly. Her tears were mixed with the happiness Lupita felt. A meeting like a father and daughter that Lupita didn't even feel from her own father. But Lupita's happiness turned into heart-wrenching tears, where she realized that her meeting with Creasy might be the last time, a memory that will never disappear throughout her life. And then the movie ended.